Hi, I'm Ernabel Demillo. Welcome to Asian American Life. Today, we look at the U.S. and international response to the humanitarian crisis in the Philippines. In early November, Typhoon Haiyan swept through the Philippines, leaving thousands of people dead and millions homeless and desperate without basic essentials of food, water, or medicine. An outpouring of international aid has arrived, but it will be a long road to recovery for this devastated country. Here's the latest. Entire towns were leveled by the 195-mile-per-hour winds and tsunami-like storm surges. Typhoon Haiyan, also known as Yolanda, was one of the strongest tropical cyclones in the history of the Philippines. According to the United Nations, over 4 million people have been displaced, affecting more than 14 million people. Months later, the death toll is still rising in the thousands, while hundreds of people remain missing. Relief has poured in from all over the world, including $414 million from the United States. Most of the money will be used to support clean water, emergency relief, reconstruction, and rehabilitation plans. It will take years to restore and rebuild this country's infrastructure, but the victims of Yolanda are incredibly resilient and have managed to return to some sense of normalcy. The relief, recovery, and rebuilding efforts in the Philippines are continuing through the new year, and more aid is pouring in. But is it reaching the hardest hit areas? Joining me now are Paul Lin, Asian American Life correspondent. Also with us is Mario De Leon Jr. He is the Consul General of the Philippine Consulate General in New York. Also here is Devanand Ramiah. He is the regional team leader for Asia Pacific at the Bureau for Crisis Prevention and Recovery, a division of the United Nations Development Program. And also here is Rolando Lavarro Jr., the Council President of Jersey City. He's been working with the local Filipino communities in New Jersey. Welcome to everyone. This is a major disaster. We hope a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. Let me ask you first, Ambassador, your general assessment of the relief efforts and also the international response.
Well, one thing I would say is the international, I'll start first with international response. I think it was quite fast, right? Right now, I think our figures have reached about almost 400 million. That's coming from both multilateral and bilateral sources. And it's both in financial aid and at the same time relief supplies and also emergency missions. Now, at the start, we had some difficulties, accessing the towns that were badly hit. It's because, of course, of the intensity of the typhoon. This is the first time that we had a signal number 4 in the Philippines. It's a category 5 when it comes to hurricane here in the Atlantic side of the world. So I think it took some time, although the government, of course, agrees that there were some lapses at the start. I think that right now there is already better coordination, not only with government, the local government, but also with all the relief agencies on the ground.
Now, Rolando, you represent a community of Filipinos in Jersey City, about 17,000. In the state, about 170,000. You've been in contact on the ground locally. What have you been hearing? How have you been connecting people with the relief effort?
People have been extending themselves to me directly. So it's taken a little effort on my part to actually reach out because people have been moved to action and wanting to provide relief to the people of the Philippines. So the Filipino community in Jersey City, as you said, large and growing population, has been organizing efforts throughout the city of Jersey City, but also throughout the entire state of New Jersey, and I know in New York City as well. And as a councilman, I've been trying to support them and encourage them and continue to keep it at the forefront and awareness of the relief efforts, because we know this is going to be a long-term process. And so if I can do something in my capacity to continue to move relief efforts forward and just keep it in people's awareness going forward, I'm going to do everything I can to do that. The other thing I would say is that the broader community has been extraordinarily responsive as well, and people just approach me all the time asking, what can I do, what can I do?
According to the U.S. Census, the Filipino American community is the second largest Asian American group nationwide. They're helping to raise funds to rebuild the Philippines.
I'm Kyung Yoon in Woodside, Queens, also known as Little Manila, with one of the largest Filipino populations in the tri-state area. We'll hear what Filipino American communities are doing to support victims of Typhoon Haiyan.
Donation tins are a common sight these days at Crystal's Cafe and other stores that line this patch of Roosevelt Avenue in Queens.
From the Filipino American community here, we see a very vibrant response to what has happened because of Typhoon Haiyan. People are donating, people are mobilizing, people are doing fundraisers just because they want to give back.
Across the country, events like this one in New York and in California are raising much-needed funds to help those devastated by Typhoon Haiyan. Chris Hilo of the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns has been coordinating Filipino American relief efforts. She says the immediate priority has been to send money, not goods.
As we realize that the dollar here is strong. And so if we give it to them, they're able to buy whatever type of relief goods they really need. Because the relief goods that we were getting, a lot of them were clothes, a lot of them were things that they might not actually need. So we decided monetary is the best way to go because people might need communications, help in basic medical supplies, food, water.
National Filipino youth organizations like Anankybayan New York are also mobilizing students to take action.
They feel that kind of connection to the homeland and wanting to respond right away and do it through what they're also passionate about, you know, what they love to do and using their talents to provide for the Filipino people.
The Filipino population has grown by nearly 30% in the New York area over the past decade. Many have come here to work to support their families back home.
Several people that we work with in this community here, actually majority of the people we work with through NAFCON are migrant workers. So they have families back home. They are the sole person that comes and works, sends their paycheck over to the Philippines in order to support their families. One of those nurses that we were working with reported to us saying she's lost everything because she is from one of the islands that was directly impacted.
Typhoon Haiyan may have been the biggest, but Hilo points out that it's just the latest in a series to hit her homeland, including Typhoon Ondoy in 2009 and Pablo in 2012. She says the violent weather patterns require an international response.
That's why NAFCON has taken an initiative to create a Task Force Haiyan, to include people that are not Filipino, to include unions, churches, everybody who can help out to ensure that we educate our community that this is an international issue. The Philippines has taken the brunt of the effects of climate change. We can no longer take that brunt anymore. Thousands of families, thousands of people impacted.
Seeing this devastation on the screen and thinking about our own families is just, it's really sad for the youth here. Filipino-American youth are able to come together, you know, and show their, you know, solidarity to the Filipino people by holding these fundraisers and really addressing, you know, the issue of climate change.
And in the new year, many Filipino-American organizations are planning medical and other mission trips so that people can personally go to help with rebuilding efforts. I'm Kyung Yoon for Asian American Life.
Now, certainly saving lives is the immediate focus of relief, providing temporary shelter, food, water, medicine as well. But what about the recovery? I do want to bring Dev in here. You've been involved in many other major recovery efforts, including the Asian tsunami. What is the timing for disaster recovery? Is it already underway in the Philippines? What is the role in conjunction with the government?
In the case of Philippines, one of the unique aspects is that the time period to move from the relief to recovery efforts is much more compressed. We have seen in other disasters, it takes actually a longer time for people to get back to their houses and start rebuilding their lives. In the case of Philippines, it's happening much faster. It also in some sense demonstrates the resilience of the people and also to a certain extent the response of the government and the international community. And in terms of the recovery efforts, the focus is for us as a UN development program is on the resilient recovery aspect of it. What we mean by that is what we want to make sure that the people who go back do not go back to their pre-crisis level of living conditions. We need to make sure that we build back better, that they are better prepared for another disaster of this magnitude. So it's happening very fast.
You know, we had mentioned that there is no sort of like FEMA in the Philippines. Is there talk of creating something like that?
They do actually have the National Disaster Management Center. They have authority that is focused on the preparedness and relief recovery efforts. And Philippines is not, they are very used to disasters. They are not new to it. So they have lots of experience dealing with it. Of course, the magnitude of this particular disaster was much higher than lots of people's expectations. Of course, the focus now should be on the current entities. I think one of the things that governments tend to do in this kind of disaster is to look back and say where things went wrong, and like the ambassador pointed out, most of this response happens at the local level. So even at the central level, if you have a very strong response capacity, sometimes it doesn't trickle down. So in terms of rebuilding efforts, one of the things even we would focus on is how can we strengthen the capacities of organizations like this or entities like this to better respond to disasters in the future in terms of early warning capacities, weather predictions, evacuations, evacuation centers, pre-positioning of supplies and things like that.
Consul General De Leon, if you could please address the government's rehabilitation plan, the size, the current size and scope of it at the moment.
Actually, there are three phases. Dev mentioned earlier the relief efforts. As far as the relief efforts are concerned, we're very thankful, of course, for the UN to issue immediately a flash appeal for about 348 million. I think that's the latest estimate that they had. But at the same time, we have to take into account that there are immediate concerns that have to be addressed so that people will start going back to their feet, right? And we're talking about providing temporary shelter. I mean, based on the assessments on the ground, I think this is one area that has not been really met by relief agencies throughout the world. So I think that's the focus right now, temporary shelter. You have to provide bank houses, of course, for people. They have to have shelter. You have to repair the schools. You know, children have to go somewhere, you know. They've been out of school for some time. You have to rebuild the health sector. I mean, many hospitals were destroyed, rural health units. And at the same time, you have to jumpstart livelihood opportunities. And you know, most of those affected are in the agricultural sector. So you have to give farmers seedlings, and at the same time, you have to give fishermen, you know, who lost their livelihood. All of their boats were practically destroyed. So you're doing all of these things. So while you are providing relief efforts, at the same time, you should already start those immediately critical needs that I mentioned, plus power. You know, power has not been restored in still many areas, so those are all critical. And the National Economic Development Authority, which is the national planning agency, has estimated that needs at least about $900 million. And if you take into account what the UN is also planning to give, you know, I think what was funded is about half of it, right? Just about half of it. So that's an immense amount that has to be poured in. And the National Economic Development Authority has put a one-year time frame on that.
The ambassador is actually right on point, because it reassures me to hear him say that, because at the end of the day what happens is that sometimes the focus is too much on the relief in these cases, but like I mentioned, because the time period is compressed, we are working, and when I say the UN system, together with the local government authorities to do some of the things that he mentioned about. So one of the main things that's taking place now is debris clearance. So debris clearance also, you just can't go and clear debris everywhere. You need to prioritize because you have limited resources, limited time. So maybe schools and hospitals and, you know, things that is immediate for the community. And sometimes the way we do debris clearance is we involve the community to do it. So that way, you know, it's cash for work. People don't understand is that you can end up in an evacuation center, and it often the well-to-do are okay, but the more the vulnerable and the poorest of the poor, and especially women and children, what happens is that they might be in an evacuation center and they might be getting some rice and some of the basic food amenities, but to buy even some basic amenities they don't have cash at hands, because so some of those things helps through debris clearance when we do cash for work. Sometimes we
In the early going, a couple 100,000 people will be employed.
Yeah, the target according to the flash appeal, by the way, this is what UN is targeting, but the government program would be broader, is about 1.5 million people is what we are targeting, not direct beneficiaries, but through these programs to support overall early recovery. What we call early recovery is to get the people on their feet earlier. Some of it would include, for instance, even asset replacement, so fishing nets and fishing boats and seedlings like the ambassador mentioned.
Right, 'cause these people lost their livelihood.
The human development impact on the people, the poverty level, their livelihoods, all that is much more difficult to deal with. So what we do is that the recovery program that the government is putting together, we are working with the government to augment it with the assessment that's together with the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UN and the European Union. We are all supporting the government to pull this together through some of the assessments, which also will look at the human element to it. And some of our programs would target to get them back on their feet as quickly as possible.
And another issue seems to also be the refugees that have now flooded Manila and other neighboring islands. And what effort is going to be done to convince them to return?
Yeah, if I could just respond to that first before Dev responds to that. Well, first of all, I think you have to put back commerce there. I think we have to have the public markets back to life, right? And at the same time, Deb mentioned something very important, cash for work. People need cash, But if they don't buy something, where will they go, right? So you need to jumpstart the economy more by opening up markets. I mean, I think those are very critical. There should be economic activities in the areas affected.
But generally speaking, it's also trauma. What happens is we have seen in other disasters like the tsunami and the cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, is initial people's reaction is, no, we are not going to go back. This is where the water came in, this is where I lost the family. But you often, if you see back 6 months along the line, people, when they recover from the initial trauma, most of them want to go back. They want to go back to their houses. They don't want to live anywhere else, so that would happen naturally too.
We're talking billions of dollars in rebuilding. Ambassador, can the Philippines afford that?
Right now, I think the National Economic Development Authority has estimated, I mean, these are very preliminary estimates, of at least 2.6 billion for the rehabilitation. So what they're trying to focus on are what I mentioned earlier, the critical immediate needs, just to jumpstart all of these towns that have been hard hit and for the people to go back to their feet. Right, so since it is a longer term, then that's something that we can work on with our bilateral partners, with the United Nations, so that you have at least elbow room for planning. If you need something like $2.6 billion, that's a lot of money, right? I mean, if it can't be met by the budget of the government, then definitely you have to source it from elsewhere. And where else can you source it? But it has to be done through the international community, private, and at the same time governments.
I'd like to hear from both of these gentlemen here about just the private sector and how their commitment will help to rebuild stronger buildings and with the technology that they have. Certainly zoning is another issue, but we've sort of addressed that. Talk about the role of the private sector.
No, in terms of the costing itself, it's not a question of whether a government can, but it should, because we all understand about prevention is better than cure, right? In this particular, the economic impact of disasters is so high. It happened in Sandy, it happened in all the other disasters, that the investments up front would have a major benefit on the long term, because this is not the last typhoon. There's going to be many more cyclones and other kind of disasters. And there was the Bohol earthquake, which was only about a couple of months ago, which, by the way, that recovery efforts is going on. So the private sector is a critical component of it, because some tourist areas also have been impacted and private sector will do their own rebuilding. But what we have noticed is that disasters open up a very small window to do the kind of policy changes that is required for building back better. Because in the normal situations, getting these policy changes is very difficult. So what happens is that it opens up opportunities. For instance, when you rebuild the schools, you won't just rebuild a normal school, you will rebuild a school that can double up as a cyclone shelter. You would make sure that it meets certain standards in terms of flooding and water surges, that you would, maybe even sometimes you might have to move critical buildings. You're looking at even local government, for instance, which the ambassador mentioned, which was the first point of your first responders. If they were affected, do we move some of those officers and the critical infrastructure in terms of communication and responses? Do you put it in different kind of building typologies that can withstand some major disasters? So these things have to be taken into consideration.
Oh, definitely, I agree with that. It provides a window of opportunity. I mean, to change policies and at the same time to prepare better, right? And I think many of the towns were flattened, so that's a tremendous opportunity to change the land use plan, right? So that will enable local governments to locate. Deb, for instance, mentioned about the need for schoolhouses that can double up immediately as evacuation centers. I mean, one of the great lessons here in this typhoon is many of the schools that were used as evacuation centers became a death trap to quite a number of people, simply because they were located very near the ocean. So I think those are things that have to look at. I mean, it's a very compelling reason why they should change their land use plans. Right, so that's an opportunity. And secondly, of course, whenever a lot of investments are poured into communities that were affected, it instills, of course, a lot of economic activity. And I think hopefully this will continue and be sustained so that, all of the community members will be in a position to go back much faster.
Rolando.
Yeah, I agree with what both of them have said at this point. And making more structures that are sustainable, and making sure that they're just safer than they were before. And but the other thing I would just add in terms of the economic incentives, there'll be steep and heavy incentives to bring some of that business and development and investment back into the region. But just like in New Jersey, when we see an influx of money, we saw a lot of controversy about kind of where some of that money goes and things like that. And so there has to be a lot of some controls. At the same time, you want to move things quickly because there's an urgency to getting things moving, but you also want to see some controls around that to ensure that the money is being spent appropriately.
And because we're talking about a long rebuilding process, how important is individual international supports? Like, for instance, Pew just came out with a study that showed that Americans in general really lost interest in the typhoon in regards to following on the news. As a comparison, 10 days after the Haiti earthquake, Americans had donated $300 million almost immediately. After the hurricane, or after the typhoon, Americans donated $33 million. Why do you think there is that discrepancy? And also, how do we get the American people to continue to support something like this? Because, like I said, it's going to be a continuous effort to rebuild, to continue to fund all the different organizations out there on the ground in this area. Dev?
The people's attention, what we see is that there's a short window to mobilize resources after disasters. And the resources come from a couple of sources. One is private donation. That's what you're talking about, where people give money, and that is driven a lot by the media and the media's attention span. And what happens is that, unfortunately, it's also correlated to the number of deaths. So if you go back and look at the tsunami and some of the bigger disasters, people are driven, and then there are fundraising events and things like that. But most of the rebuilding budgets actually come from the government's own budgets, as well as, aid plus loans. So some of the big IFIs, the International Financial Institution loan. So going to answer your question, I think it needs to be driven by communities and different, faith-based organizations in other countries, especially in the US, to try and mobilize funds. I know that Philippines is it's one of the big Catholic countries, and I know some of the churches and the CRS, the Catholic Relief Services, and others are mobilizing resources, but we could never know how much was mobilized and where it goes, because that's one of the biggest challenges in any disasters, because there are lots of aid that goes through the official channels, so like the UN aid and all of that would be tracked, but whereas there are lots of also bilateral aid that goes to individuals, communities, faith-based organizations, small NGOs, so we wouldn't know the figures for sure.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the overseas Filipino workers who send back so much of their paychecks.
I think people I speak to in Jersey City, residents and Filipinos who have family and loved ones back home, that if they're not giving to the relief agencies or directly to the government, they feel like the best thing to do is just give it to my family and or friends and others, and help them to rebuild their home, their specific. I'm sure a lot of that is going on as well. Right. I don't know that any of that ever gets measured.
Hard to measure, yes.
In the total the givings and so forth.
Any
Yeah.
final thoughts? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just like to put context into how the typhoon hit the Philippines economically. I mean, the Undersecretary for Finance was here earlier this week, and they had a non-deal roadshow. And what they said is only about 2.2% of GDP will be affected because that comprise actually the economic contribution of the regions that were badly hit. And we're talking about Eastern Visayas. Please remember that Eastern Visayas is the most impoverished region in the Philippines. So in other words, people are coming from a very low economic level. So if it's hit, granted that most of the towns were flattened, I mean, the impact in the overall economy is not really that bad, right? I mean, that's what they're saying. So in other words, as long as the Filipinos just continue to contribute about 10% of GDP, as you mentioned earlier, I think we're not so bad off. Maybe those who have families in Eastern Visayas might have to shell out more, and they have to sacrifice more. So, I mean, I look at the problem in that perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Consul General De Leon, Mr. Ramiah, and City Council President Lavarro, and of course, Paul Lin, thank you for joining our show. If you'd like to learn more about Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, please visit our website at www.cuny.tv. I'm Ernabel Demillo for Asian American Life. Thank you for watching our show.